If you have been active in the political arena for a long time on many platforms, it is extremely likely that you have encountered this term at least once or twice. Fascism is capitalism in decay. This expression is predominantly utilized and championed by Marxists and several other leftist anti-capitalist factions. But what does it exactly mean? Essentially, it represents a method of identifying and defining fascism from a Marxist perspective. The interpretation is as follows. Whenever the capitalist order faces the threat of being overturned by the workers, and when all other alternatives prove ineffective, the bourgeois elites will deploy their final strategy to safeguard their capital: fascism. The fascists will then, so to speak, overthrow the government, initiating severe repressions and committing atrocities against the workers and socialists as a desperate and violent measure to preserve capitalism and its power. This is why it is called capitalism in decay. It is invoked precisely when capitalism is nearing its breaking point and is on the brink of collapse. Thus, fascism is essentially capitalism in its most violent and vulnerable form, serving merely as an additional mechanism employed by capitalists to shield themselves and perpetuate their monopoly on exploitation. And if one examines instances such as Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy and observes how these regimes ascended to power, the theory appears to hold water at first glance. Both Mussolini and Hitler rose to prominence during periods of crisis and substantial political unrest. They consistently formed alliances with major corporations, secured power with the support and assistance of conservative elites, and, most crucially, suppressed and aggressively eradicated communism. However, as is often the case, the devil lies in the details. A more detailed examination of the environment and circumstances surrounding their ascent to and maintenance of power reveals a complexity that Marxists tend to oversimplify. The purpose of this video is to analyze the Marxist assertion that fascism is capitalism in decay, piece by piece, and to demonstrate the inaccuracies in this claim. I will actually take a bit of a different approach to this topic. While other YouTubers addressing this issue have predominantly explored the ideological dimensions of fascism, aiming to explain from an ideological standpoint why fascism is anti-capitalist, this video will diverge from that path. As our communist friends like to say, we will concentrate on the tangible, material facts. Meaning, I will divide this video into 4 parts. We will begin by analyzing the political unrest that facilitated the rise of fascism, explore their affiliations and connections with major corporations, examine their interactions with conservative elites, and finally, I will elaborate on why communists hold this belief, concluding that this viewpoint does not stem from an objective analysis, but is rather ideologically driven. As with some of my previous videos discussing fascism, I will primarily concentrate on Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany for several reasons. A. They had sufficient time to elaborate their vision and were, in a manner of speaking, more intellectually evolved. And B. They succeeded in seizing power independently without the assistance of foreign nations. Without further ado, let us jump into the crises that led to fascism rising in the first place. When discussing the rise of Benito Mussolini and the Italian fascists, one curious topic, which almost certainly contributed a lot to their rise in popularity, were the clashes in the countryside of the Po Valley, which effectively won the fascists the support of the peasant farmers and landowners. So, what happened? After the conclusion of the First World War, Italy conducted its first post-war election in 1919, resulting in the Italian Socialist Party emerging as the victor and establishing a new government. An examination of the electoral map reveals that they secured a majority throughout the Po Valley, an area primarily characterized by its agrarian economy. The socialists swiftly assumed comprehensive control over the agricultural wage labor market, necessitating that any farmer in need of laborers had to engage through the socialist labor exchange. However, the most challenging aspect was the labor exchange's mandate for farmers to employ workers on a year-round basis as opposed to seasonally, and to offer higher wages. This policy financially burdened farmers throughout the valley, adding even more pressure on their already hard lives. This situation might not have been so dire had the government provided subsidies or other forms of support to ease the farmers' financial strains. Unfortunately, the socialist takeover of the labor market was executed without offering any support to the struggling farmers, effectively disregarding their plight. Desperate for assistance, the farmers sought help elsewhere. And I think you can see where this is going. In the face of neglect from public authorities, the farmers of the Po Valley turned to the blackshirts for protection. Armed with a pretext to confront their long-standing rivals, they stormed City Hall in Bologna, resulting in the deaths of 6 individuals. From there, the movement rapidly expanded throughout the valley. In the initial half of 1921, the Blackshirts demolished 70 newspapers and printing facilities, 59 socialist headquarters, 119 socialist employment offices, 82 peasants' leagues, among other targets. During this period, hundreds of individuals lost their lives, and the socialists were effectively expelled from the valley. To consolidate their victory, the fascists created their own control over the agricultural labor market, delivering what the peasants most desired: employment and land. By allocating small plots of land to a select number of peasants, land that was acquired through intimidation from the original owners, they convinced a substantial number of landless peasants to forsake the socialist unions and align with them, thereby securing dominion over the countryside of the Po Valley. The debacle in the Po Valley represented a monumental and embarrassing defeat for the socialists, shooting their own foot in probably the worst way possible. Their agricultural policy not only failed dramatically, but also inadvertently laid the groundwork for the fascist takeover of the valley. This incident might seem to support the Marxist perspective, suggesting that the wealthy landowners, feeling threatened by the righteous socialists, summoned reinforcements to defend them. However, this interpretation overlooks a crucial detail. The fascists did not solely appeal to the landowners, but to all farmers, irrespective of their wealth. By establishing their monopoly, the fascists specifically catered to the peasants' needs by redistributing land from wealthy landowners, achieved through either force or coercion. Moreover, the act of a political group capitalizing on a rival's error to advance their position is a fundamental principle of politics. Subsequently, during the March on Rome, the Italian socialist government was so deeply divided over its course of action that it effectively incapacitated itself, rendering governance impossible. More than half of its coalition in parliament was dismissed for merely proposing a dialogue with Mussolini. Ultimately, it was indeed the electoral victory of the socialists that precipitated the ascendancy of fascism. By quote-unquote victory, I refer to their success in the elections. It wasn't the socialist threat to the capitalist system that facilitated Mussolini's rise to power, but rather their profound ineffectiveness and fueling of problems that paved the way for fascist takeover. Had the government exhibited even a marginal increase in competence, the March on Rome might very well have failed. When it comes to the rise of Hitler in Germany, this is a much more complex topic, as the emergence of National Socialism resulted from a convergence of multiple crises, given that Weimar Germany was far from a bastion of political stability. However, a distinguishing factor of the Nazis, compared to other political entities, was their broad appeal across all societal strata. Hitler garnered support from the lower, middle, and upper classes, unlike the German left, which primarily attracted the working class, and the conservative factions, which appealed predominantly to the middle and upper classes. Unlike their counterparts, who were closely associated with specific interests, social classes, or political strategies, the Nazis offered promises that resonated across the board, targeting various occupations with little concern for potential contradictions among their pledges. Nonetheless, the pivotal moment that significantly bolstered the Nazis' ascent was undoubtedly the Great Depression and the economic downturn in Germany in 1930. As unemployment soared and millions found themselves jobless, radical groups gained momentum. The response to the crisis varied among the parties. The German left proposed tax increases to fund unemployment benefits, whereas moderates and conservatives advocated for a reduction in social expenditures to facilitate tax cuts. The narrative becomes particularly intriguing when considering the impact of the March on Rome on the German left, especially the Social Democratic SPD and the Communist KPD, who both believed the Nazis were orchestrating a coup, albeit their interpretations of the situation were markedly different. We will primarily focus on the communist perspective, which was predicted on the belief that a social revolution was imminent. From this viewpoint, the ascent of the Nazis could inadvertently benefit the communist agenda by initiating a quote-unquote pendulum movement, first swinging to the right and then to the left. However, it's important to note the KPD's staunch refusal to collaborate with the SPD, whom they deemed social fascists, despite the SPD being among the few actively and openly anti-Nazi factions at the time. Convinced that the SPD was as much of an adversary as the Nazis, the KPD rejected any form of alliance with the Social Democrats to forge a leftist anti-Hitler coalition. The last thing the German communists were inclined to do was assist the SPD in safeguarding democratic institutions. Then there is also another moment when the KPD, unironically, cooperated with the Nazis in the Wildcat Strike of November 1932. Yeah, this is just peak leftist infighting right here. But let's get back on track. The Weimar Republic was such in a horrible condition that for nearly 3 years, Germany was subject to an unstable emergency government lacking a clear majority. President Hindenburg was compelled to enact legislation without the support of a majority in the legislature, leading to a government that was, predictably, largely ineffective. Keep in mind, when the deadlock was gripping the German political system in early 1930s, the Nazi Party was initially a minor party, securing merely 2.8% of the vote in the 1928 parliamentary elections. But with nationalist agitation, collapse of farm prices and the economy, and urban unemployment, managed to catapult the NSDAP in the 1930 election from 12 to 107 seats out of 491 in the parliament, already becoming the second largest party. So we can already see two patterns emerging with the Italian fascists and the Nazis. Both movements ascended during periods of substantial political chaos, and in each instance, the left was so engulfed in internal conflicts that they were unable to effectively counteract the rise of these fascist regimes. Their role in the fascist ascension in both nations was significant, albeit not in the manner that Marxists might assume. Rather than the socialists posing such a formidable and unified threat that the establishment felt compelled to summon fascism as a countermeasure, it was, in fact, their disarray and pervasive internal strife that inadvertently provided fascism with the opportunity to establish a strong presence. In an ironic twist, they unwittingly aided their greatest adversary without even realizing it. Now, I will admit here, in regards to this part, I have actually found little information on what the relationship was like between Mussolini's fascists and businesses before the March on Rome. The primary source I use for this video, Anatomy of Fascism by Paxton, as well as the sources quoted in it, also admit that this aspect of Italian fascism has not been studied much. I even tried searching for some articles online, but to no avail, so I am not willing to talk about an issue I don't have enough information on. So if anyone here has more information on that matter, I will be happy to see what you have to say in the comments. The only thing Paxton could really dig up was when Mussolini broke with the socialists in 1914, nationalist newspaper publishers and industrialists, and even the French government paid for his new paper Il Popolo d'Italia. But the purpose of that was to bring Italy into the First World War, so it's not exactly too relevant for our topic. But the same can't be said for the Nazis, and oh boy, do I have the juice for this one. The Marxist interpretation suggests Hitler was virtually crafted by big businesses as a sort of private anti-communist force, as I initially explained. Yet, a closer examination of Hitler's early interactions with major businesses reveals a different narrative. Marxists frequently reference industrialist and steel manufacturer Fritz Thyssen and his book I Paid Hitler to bolster their argument. While it's true that Thyssen supported Hitler, his case was somewhat atypical, both in terms of his early backing of Nazism and his subsequent dissociation and exile after 1939. Emil Kiedow, another prominent figure who initially supported the Nazis, was a coal industry magnate. Kiedow affiliated himself with the Nazi Party in 1927, only to exit in frustration a year later due to the party's criticism of the coal syndicate, subsequently shifting his allegiance to the more conservative DNVP. Of course, there were certainly businessmen, usually from small businesses, drawn to Hitler's promises of expansionist nationalism and pledges to shield Germany from the perceived threats of communists and social democrats. If we scrutinize the German business archives, they show that most German businessmen contributed to all the non-socialist electoral parties that showed any sign of defeating Marxism, for obvious reasons. While it is accurate that some German companies did fund the Nazis, their financial contributions were consistently larger to the traditional conservative parties. One factor contributing to the reluctance of major businesses to financially support the Nazis was the anti-capitalist rhetoric espoused by several of Hitler's close associates, such as Gottfried Feder and Otto Strasser, whom Hitler derogatorily referred to as a salon Bolshevik. Even Gregor Strasser, who led the Nazi Party's administrative apparatus and was comparatively more moderate than his brother Otto, advocated for radical employment initiatives that did not align well with the interests of large businesses. Some important firms, such as IG Farben, contributed almost nothing at all to the Nazis before Hitler's ascent to power in 1933. There is a lack of evidence to suggest that large corporations significantly bankrolled the Nazis before this period. Horst Matzerath and Henry A. Turner, in their 1977 essay on the NSDAP's self-sufficiency, found that a substantial portion of the party's funding originated from entrance fees at mass rallies, sale of Nazi literature and memorabilia, and modest donations. Obviously, the dynamics shifted significantly thereafter. Businessmen began to significantly support the new Nazi government, adjusting to a regime that would subsequently reward them handsomely with contracts for armaments and similar ventures. Yet, this does not alter the reality that before 1933, Hitler received virtually no substantial support from major business entities. If one were to adhere to the Marxist interpretation of fascism, it would be expected that industrialists would have been eagerly financing the NSDAP as German society became increasingly radicalized. Nonetheless, the factual evidence thoroughly refutes this perspective. It is accurate to state that both Hitler and Mussolini did not rise to power solely through their own efforts. No dictator can govern alone. He must secure the collaboration of various governing bodies: the military, the police, the judiciary, civil servants, and influential social and economic sectors. And it is traditional conservative elites who gave them the opportunity to ascend to power. It was the conservatives like von Papen who suggested the idea for Hitler to become chancellor, and Italian conservatives agreed to cooperate with Mussolini's government. And this was all mostly done to keep the socialists out of power. So hopefully, here we will have something to back up the Marxist viewpoint, right? Again, on the surface, this looks to be the case. A closer inspection of the nature of this quote-unquote alliance reveals that fascists and conservatives did not align closely on many fronts, apart from their mutual opposition to the left. In the political landscapes of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, one could witness a kind of tug-of-war between conservative elements and fascist movements. Conservatives aim to revert to a cautious, traditional form of authoritarianism that honored property rights and social hierarchy. In contrast, fascists aspire to a dynamic, equalizing populist dictatorship, ready to override any private interest in favor of the collective. It was inevitable that a clash would arise between these two factions once their shared adversary was neutralized. Both nations experienced what might be termed a dual state scenario, that is, the existence of two competing power structures within the country, the state and the party. It is crucial to distinguish between these two entities. This is something that political scientist Ernst Fraenkel used to write about. According to Fraenkel, there were two competing forces. On one side, there was the quote-unquote normative state, which included the official government bodies and traditional public services. This part of the government tried to stick to the law and used regular methods for hiring and promoting people based on their skills and experience. On the other side, there was the quote-unquote prerogative state, made up of the fascist party's own groups. This part didn't follow any set rules, but operated based on what Hitler or Mussolini wanted, what the party members desired, and what they thought was the nation's fate. These two parts, although they often clashed, managed to work together in a strange mix of following the law in some areas while being completely lawless and violent in others. For example, Hitler never formally abolished the 1919 German Constitution, and he never really dismantled the normative state. But he himself refused to be bound by it, like when he refused to have a euthanasia law drafted for fear of having his hands tied by rules and bureaucracy. So, why is this distinction between the normative and prerogative state important? Keep in mind that according to our Marxist friends, this distinction does not exist at all. They are all essentially under the same capitalist umbrella, fighting for the influence of the almighty dollar. Unfortunately for them, this distinction and tug-of-war is very real. As Hitler began to solidify his regime, his erstwhile conservative allies, who had played a crucial role in his ascent to power, transformed into his de facto rivals. These conservatives engaged in a defensive struggle to preserve the independence of their remaining spheres of influence against the incursion of the Nazi Party's parallel structures. They sought to protect the army from the SA, state governments from regional Nazi leaders, the civil service from inexperienced party members, and so forth. One of the most striking instances of this conflict involved Franz von Papen, the deputy chancellor who initially proposed Hitler for the chancellorship. Von Papen publicly criticized and condemned the Nazis in a speech at the University of Marburg. Hitler's response was swift and punitive. He had von Papen's speechwriter Edgar Jung arrested, prohibited the speech's publication, and shuttered von Papen's offices. Subsequently, von Papen was removed from his role as deputy chancellor and appointed ambassador to Austria. The death of President Hindenburg on August 2nd marked a decisive end to the conservative resistance, effectively sealing their fate. As Hitler intensified his efforts to bring every facet of the normative state under the dominion of his party, significant actions were taken to ensure this control extended across all sectors. A pivotal moment occurred in 1938 when the Foreign Office was commandeered by the Nazi Party. This involved dismissing the career diplomat Konstantin von Neurath and appointing Joachim von Ribbentrop, alongside his Nazi cronies, to prominent diplomatic positions internationally. In the context of Italy, Mussolini's regime, while aggressive in its control, did not achieve the total domination seen under Hitler's Germany, leading some to consider it less than fully totalitarian. Yet within Fascist Italy, similar struggles for dominance ensued among the leader, the party, the state bureaucracy, and civil society. Mussolini was compelled to navigate the political landscape much like any traditional prime minister, orchestrating coalitions and advocating for legislation. Moreover, he shared power with King Victor Emmanuel III and had to continually appease the Catholic Church. Such extensive concessions led to criticism within his own ranks, with many prominent figures within the fascist party accusing Mussolini of compromising the movement's purity and objectives by allowing conservative quote-unquote fellow travelers to dilute the essence and aims of fascism. So, while the conservatives and fascists may work together to bring down Marxists and other socialist parties, fundamentally, they are gonna come to clash with each other. That is because, I know this may shock some of you, but at the end of the day, fascists and conservatives are two different groups with two different ideas and two different visions of how the country should be run. I know. I'm gonna give some of you time to process this unbelievable revelation. This also begs the question, if conservatives and fascists are all the same, serving the same capitalist master with the same interest, then why would these clashes between the normative and prerogative states happen? Why were Hitler and Mussolini so determined to replace all aspects of the country with their party's bureaucracy? Aren't they in the end serving the exact same master? Interestingly, history has demonstrated that conservative authoritarian regimes are most effective at preventing the rise of fascism, or even in managing it. Fascists have historically formed alliances with conservatives, yet the outcomes of such partnerships have been mixed. When fascist groups assume a subordinate role within conservative regimes, they seldom achieve their ambitious goals of societal and historical transformation. Conservative authoritarian leaders, typically more dominant, disapprove of the fascists' eagerness for violence and their disregard for established norms and interests, particularly when these groups cling to their initial radical visions for societal overhaul. I will quote Paxton directly on this matter. Quote, "We have already noted the bloodiest suppression of a fascist junior partner by an authoritarian dictator, the liquidation of the Legion of the Archangel Michael by the Romanian dictator Marshal Antonescu in January 1941. As we will see in Chapter 6, the Iberian dictators Franco and Salazar reduced fascist parties to powerlessness, though less bloodily. The Brazilian dictator Vargas tolerated a fascist movement and then crushed it." In general, well-entrenched conservative regimes of all sorts have provided unfavorable terrain for fascism to reach power. Either they have repressed what they regarded as fomenters of disorder, or they have preempted fascism's issues and following for themselves. If conservatives could rule alone, they did. Obviously, as I have shown, the dots really don't add that much up for the Marxists. Fascists exploit inherent political turmoil to come to power. They never really had ties with big businesses before their ascent to power, and their quote-unquote alliance with the conservatives always started collapsing due to their inherently different visions and ideologies. So, why do Marxists believe in this view at all? As we know, many people since the end of World War II have been struggling and trying their best to come up with a satisfactory definition for fascism, but the Marxists were the ones who probably came up with the oldest interpretation of it since the early 1920s. As I have already explained in the introduction, the Marxists believe that fascism is just the anti-socialist reaction of the bourgeois, financial elites, big business, and global capitalism. Max Horkheimer, a prominent member of the Frankfurt School of Marxism, famously wrote in an essay in 1939, quote, "Whoever is not prepared to talk about capitalism should also remain silent about fascism." Originally, the term fascism was exclusively associated with Mussolini's emerging movement. It was the left-wing Italian intellectuals recognizing its oppressive and reactionary essence as a violent affront to the workers' movement who first endeavored to analyze it as a broader and more significant political phenomenon. In his 1922 critique of fascism, the Italian socialist Giovanni Zibordi pinpointed three distinct radical elements within the fascist offensive against the left: a bourgeois counter-revolution, a middle-class uprising against the liberal establishment, and a paramilitary revolt against the state. Zibordi ultimately characterized fascism as a, quote, socio-political movement of the big bourgeois, or at least a movement that it has successfully used and exploited. Here, it becomes evident that the interpretation of fascism is consistently framed within the context of class, and this perspective is not without justification. Keep in mind that Marxism extends beyond merely being a political ideology. It encompasses a comprehensive worldview, offering a lens through which to understand politics and society. At the heart of Marxism lies a focus on materialism and class. Everything is about materialism and class. In fact, Marxists have their own theory of history called historical materialism, where it claims that all conflicts in human history are about class, rich against poor, and not idealistic things like glory, religion, and national pride. Marxism doesn't just tell you how a society should be run, but how you should view it as well. And this is where the issue arises. So when Marxists get confronted with a movement like fascism, it short-circuits their brains, because their worldview is unable to literally comprehend the idea that another revolutionary ideology that wants to overthrow the status quo can exist besides them. So now, since they have to view everything through the lens of class, they have to explain the phenomena of fascism and push it into their dialectic. This is why their view of fascism is inherently ideological and subjective, rather than objective. This is why I say that trying to debate Marxists is largely useless, because, for example, if you are gonna go into debate with them on what is considered reactionary or not, they are gonna come in with their own Marxist interpretation of what reactionary is. So in order to change their opinion on this issue, you would have to smash their entire Marxist worldview first. Roger Griffin, in his book, also explains this. Quote, "Rather than modify their dualistic theory inherited from the writings of Marx and Engels of socialism's revolutionary war against a single antagonist or archenemy, capitalism, Marxists have generally denied that in the interwar period they were suddenly faced by a rival revolutionary and, at bottom, anti-capitalist, anti-bourgeois force which pursued an alternative totalizing vision to Bolshevism, namely that of a new form of modern society based not on radical socialism, but on radical nationalism." The truth is that both fascism and communism are rivals, because their position is exactly the same. They both want to overthrow the status quo and usher in a revolutionary new age for their countries shaped by their ideals. The only big difference is that for communism, that modern society is shaped by radical socialism and radical nationalism for fascism, as Griffin said. Then, the communist worldview is inherently materialistic, while the fascist one is idealistic. They are both contenders in the revolutionary arena. But again, the Marxists are unable to process this. Another revolutionary movement that has different views than ours? Impossible. They must be another branch of the capitalist root. They are unable to objectively analyze ideas like most people, but they insert their ideological viewpoint into everything, which really skews their perception of the world and politics. In conclusion, while the communist interpretation may seem plausible on the surface, a closer look will reveal that a lot of this is just not the case. The left, through their sheer infighting and incompetence, actually paved the way for fascism to gain more power. They had absolutely no ties to any major businesses before they got into power, and this quote-unquote friendship with the conservative elites either quickly broke down, or there was significant tension, with both trying to gain the upper hand over the other. This notion of fascism being capitalism in decay is not grounded in objective reality, but stems from an ideological stance that struggles to acknowledge perspectives beyond its own framework, automatically embraced by its cultist followers who trust everything blindly without a second thought.